On January 18, 2026, European ambassadors convened an emergency meeting in Brussels. The subject: how to respond to what they now officially describe as economic coercion by the United States. At the center of the discussion was a weapon the European Union has never used before: the anti-coercion instrument, the so-called trade bazooka. And for the first time since it was adopted in 2023, European leaders are actively debating whether to pull the trigger. This is not theoretical. This is not posturing. French President Emmanuel Macron has been calling EU heads of state directly, pushing for activation. European Council President Antonio Costa told reporters the bloc is prepared to respond in a united and coordinated manner. And the European Parliament has already moved to halt the ratification of the 2025 US-EU trade deal. That deal, which had been painstakingly negotiated and was meant to stabilize transatlantic trade, is now frozen indefinitely. The catalyst for all of this? On January 17, 2026, President Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on 8 European countries: Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. The tariffs start at 10% on February 1st. They escalate to 25% by June, and they come with a single demand, one that has stunned European capitals: sell Greenland to the United States. That is the ultimatum. And if you're thinking this sounds like something from an alternate history novel, you're not alone. But it's happening, and Europe's response could reshape global trade for years to come. Here's where this becomes genuinely unprecedented. The anti-coercion instrument exists specifically for moments like this. It was designed to allow the EU to retaliate against any country that uses trade as a weapon to coerce political changes. It can be deployed without going through the World Trade Organization. And the countermeasures it authorizes are sweeping: tariffs, export controls, restrictions on U.S. access to European markets, limits on services and investments. The EU has never used it against anyone, not China, not Russia, not during any prior trade dispute. But now senior EU officials are actively discussing using it against the United States, the EU's closest ally. That should tell you how serious this is. Let me give you the context. Trump's interest in Greenland is not new. He first floated the idea publicly during his first term in 2019, describing it as a large real estate deal. Denmark rejected it outright. Trump canceled a state visit in response. The matter seemed closed. Then he won the 2024 election, and the Greenland push returned, this time with far more pressure behind it. By early 2025, Trump declared that acquiring Greenland was an absolute necessity for national security. Vice President J.D. Vance visited the island. A special U.S. envoy was appointed, and Trump's rhetoric escalated. He claimed Russia and China were encircling the island, claims that have been contradicted by Nordic intelligence services, and insisted that NATO had been urging Denmark to deal with the Russian threat for 2 decades. That matters, because it means Trump isn't framing this as an economic opportunity. He's framing it as national defense. And that framing has significant legal and political implications inside the United States, including for how much unilateral authority he can claim. But Greenland doesn't belong to Denmark in the way Puerto Rico belongs to the United States. Greenland is an autonomous territory. Its people have their own government, their own parliament, and an increasing degree of self-governance. They have made their position clear. They are not for sale. A protest in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, drew nearly 1/3 of the population. Demonstrators carried signs reading, "Make America Go Away." Greenland's Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt has said publicly that the island intends to maintain its ties with Denmark, and Denmark itself has been resolute. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen warned that a forced takeover could unravel NATO. This is the position Trump is trying to change, with tariffs. Now, let's talk about what the EU could actually do. The anti-coercion instrument, formerly known as Regulation 2023-2675, was adopted on December 7, 2023, and entered into force 20 days later. It was originally conceived to counter economic pressure from China, particularly after Beijing imposed trade restrictions on Lithuania in 2021 for allowing Taiwan to open a representative office. But the text is deliberately broad. It applies to any third country engaging in coercion. Here's how it works. First, the European Commission examines whether a third country's measures, tariffs, threats, sanctions, constitute coercion. This typically takes about 4 months. Then, the Council of the EU votes, by qualified majority, to formally determine that coercion has occurred. This phase takes 8 to 10 weeks. After that, the EU engages in dialogue, consultations, mediation, possibly arbitration. Only if that fails do countermeasures kick in. But here's the critical point. Once activated, the countermeasures are extensive. They include tariffs on U.S. imports, quotas, exclusion of U.S. companies from EU public procurement contracts, defense, infrastructure, technology, restrictions on services, including digital and financial services, which is where the U.S. runs a significant surplus with Europe, limits on foreign direct investment, suspension of intellectual property protections, export controls. In other words, the EU could target the sectors where the United States actually makes money in Europe. And separately from the anti-coercion instrument, EU ambassadors are already discussing a $108 billion retaliatory tariff package, $93 billion, on U.S. goods. The list reportedly includes aircraft, agricultural products, and technology. This is not speculation. This is what was discussed in Brussels on January 18th. That brings us to the politics. Not every EU country wants to escalate. Ireland's Prime Minister Michael Martin has called ACI activation premature. Germany, which exports roughly $236 billion in goods to the United States annually, has urged caution. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni spoke directly with Trump after the tariff announcement and described the tariffs as a mistake, calling for dialogue over confrontation. But France is pushing hard in the other direction. Macron has described Trump's tariffs as unacceptable blackmail, and the European Parliament has signaled strong support for retaliation. Manfred Weber, leader of the European People's Party, said he sees no path forward on trade negotiations until the tariff threat is withdrawn. So the EU is divided, but it's divided on tactics, not on the basic proposition that what Trump is doing constitutes coercion. And that distinction matters, because even the countries urging restraint are doing so because they believe diplomacy might work, not because they believe Trump's demands are legitimate. Let's step back and look at the broader pattern. Trump has used tariffs as leverage before. During his first term, he imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on European allies under national security justifications. He threatened tariffs over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He pressured the EU over digital services taxes. And each time, the EU responded with a mix of retaliation and negotiation. But this is different. This is the first time a U.S. president has explicitly tied tariffs to a territorial demand, asking an ally to cede sovereign land. The EU's legal framework for trade retaliation didn't exist in this form until 2023. It was built in part to avoid being caught flat-footed by this exact scenario. Here's what markets are already pricing in. Since the tariff announcement, the euro and British pound have both declined. European stock markets tumbled, with automakers and luxury goods companies taking the biggest hits. Bitcoin briefly dipped below $92,000 amid the geopolitical uncertainty, and traders are now modeling scenarios they hadn't seriously considered a week ago. Full-scale trade war between NATO allies. The 2025 US-EU trade deal, which was supposed to be the foundation for stable economic relations in Trump's second term, imposed 15% tariffs on EU exports to the United States while committing Europe to purchasing American energy and defense equipment. It was a compromise. Neither side loved it, but it prevented escalation. That deal is now frozen. The European Parliament has suspended ratification proceedings, and there's growing sentiment in Brussels that the deal may be dead entirely. Here's what some analysts are saying. Jeremy Gaillon, a transatlantic relations expert, warned that failing to respond would humiliate the EU. Others argue that using the anti-coercion instrument against the United States could fracture NATO and provoke an even harsher American response. Both of those things can be true, and that's the bind. Now, let's talk about the American side. Trump's position is that Greenland is essential for U.S. security. He has said repeatedly that the United States needs full ownership, not a lease or a partnership agreement. He has invoked the Monroe Doctrine. He has referenced historical precedents, noting that the U.S. offered to buy Greenland in 1946 under Harry Truman for $100 million in gold and was turned down. His argument is that leases are unreliable, that the U.S. already operates Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, on Greenland under a 1951 defense agreement with Denmark, and that this isn't enough to counter emerging threats from China and Russia as Arctic ice melts and new shipping routes open. There is some strategic logic here. Greenland is enormous, larger than the Louisiana Purchase. It sits in a position that could be critical for monitoring Arctic activity. And yes, as climate change accelerates, access to the Arctic is becoming a major geopolitical issue. But the logic breaks down when you look at what Trump is actually proposing. Estimates prepared by former U.S. officials and scholars peg the cost of acquiring Greenland at somewhere between $500 and $700 billion. That's more than half the annual U.S. defense budget. And that figure doesn't include the infrastructure investments that would be required, estimated at over $1 trillion across 2 decades, given Greenland's remote and harsh environment. As one analysis put it, the business case is non-existent. The U.S. already has access to Greenland through existing agreements. American companies can already invest there. The strategic concerns Trump raises can be addressed without purchasing the entire island. There's another dimension worth noting here. Reporting from The Guardian revealed that a billionaire donor with interests in Greenland encouraged Trump's push for acquisition. That adds layers of private influence to what's being presented as a national security imperative. It doesn't prove Trump's motives are corrupt, but it does suggest the stated rationale may not be the complete picture. And perhaps more importantly, Greenland's population has made clear they don't want to be bought. So what is Trump actually trying to accomplish? Some observers believe this is classic Trump negotiating. Start with an extreme position, extract concessions, claim victory. Others think he's genuinely committed to the idea and sees tariffs as a way to break European resistance. And a third interpretation, gaining traction in some European circles, is that this is less about Greenland and more about testing how far the United States can push its allies without triggering a break. That interpretation is darker, and it may be accurate, because here's the thing. If the EU backs down, it validates the use of tariffs as a tool of territorial coercion against democracies. That's not just a precedent for Greenland. That's a precedent for everything. If the EU escalates, it could trigger a full trade war with the United States at a time when Europe is already dealing with energy insecurity, slow growth, and a war on its eastern border. There is no clean option. Let's talk about what happens next. The European Commission has signaled that it is willing to engage in talks. Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič has described ACI activation as a last resort. There are reports that informal channels are already open, possibly including conversations at Davos, where global leaders are gathering this week. But the tariffs are set to take effect on February 1st. That's less than 2 weeks away. And unless Trump withdraws or suspends them, the EU will face a binary choice: respond or accept. Macron has made his position clear. He wants the EU to respond with the anti-coercion instrument and retaliatory tariffs. German Chancellor and others want to exhaust diplomacy first. The European Council is expected to take up the matter formally in the coming days. Watch for any announcement of a summit or a joint statement. That will tell you which direction they're heading. Meanwhile, in the United States, congressional reaction has been mixed. Some Republicans have backed Trump's position, framing Greenland as a legitimate national security interest. Others, including some Democrats, have called the tariff threat a land grab dressed up as security policy. The legal basis for the tariffs themselves is likely to face challenges. Trump is reportedly invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allows tariffs on national security grounds. But that statute has never been used to pressure an ally into territorial concessions. It's designed to protect domestic industries, not to acquire landmass. If challenged in court, the tariffs could be struck down, but that would take time. Months, probably. And by then, the damage, economic and diplomatic, would already be done. Let's widen the lens for a moment. This crisis is not just about Greenland. It's about the future of the transatlantic alliance. NATO has been the bedrock of European security for 75 years. It has survived crises, wars, and political transitions. But it has never faced a situation where one of its founding members is using economic coercion to pressure another founding member into surrendering territory. Trump's tariff threat undermines the basic premise of collective defense, that allies do not threaten each other, that security is not a transaction, that sovereignty is respected. European leaders have noticed. A joint statement from NATO members, including the UK, France, and Germany, affirmed that Greenland's future belongs to its people and Denmark. Several countries have sent troops to Greenland for joint exercises as a show of solidarity. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who is Danish, has said he believes Trump is determined to achieve some form of integration. He's warned Greenland that its options may be limited. That's a remarkable statement from someone who spent years managing NATO's relationship with the United States. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. If this crisis escalates, it may accelerate a broader European shift away from reliance on the United States. France has been pushing for greater European defense autonomy for years. Germany has resisted, partly because of cost, partly because of strategic caution. But a sustained American campaign of economic coercion could change that calculus. Some analysts have suggested that this could be the moment Europe starts building real strategic independence. Others think that's wishful thinking, that the economic ties are too deep, the security dependencies too entrenched. Either way, the relationship is being tested in ways it hasn't been tested before. Let me bring this back to the immediate situation. The EU has tools it has never used. It is considering using them now against the United States. Trump has made a demand that no European ally is likely to accept. He is backing it with tariffs that violate the spirit, if not the letter, of decades of trade agreements. And neither side has a clear off-ramp. There's been some speculation about possible compromise arrangements, a compact of free association, for instance, where Greenland would receive U.S. financial aid in exchange for allowing expanded security cooperation. That model exists for places like the Marshall Islands. But Greenland's leaders have rejected anything that looks like a transfer of sovereignty. And Trump has said he's not interested in anything short of full ownership. So unless one side changes its position, this is heading toward confrontation. What questions remain? First, will the EU actually activate the anti-coercion instrument, or will it rely on standard retaliatory tariffs? The distinction matters. ACI activation would be a statement that the EU views U.S. actions as fundamentally coercive, not just economically aggressive. Second, will Trump back down, delay, or escalate? His track record suggests he doubles down under pressure, but he's also transactional. If the EU signals it's willing to negotiate on other issues, defense spending for instance, he might look for a face-saving exit. Third, how will markets react? The euro and pound have already declined amid the uncertainty. Stock markets are volatile. If tariffs go into effect and the EU retaliates, the economic damage could be significant, potentially shaving 0.25% off EU GDP and raising consumer prices on both sides of the Atlantic. Fourth, what does this mean for NATO? The alliance has survived a lot, but it hasn't survived a full-blown economic war between its two largest members. If that happens, the political cohesion required to maintain collective defense could erode. If this crisis escalates, it may accelerate a broader European shift away from reliance on the United States. France has been pushing for greater European defense autonomy for years. And fifth, what precedent does this set? If the United States can use tariffs to demand territorial concessions from allies, where does that stop? What happens the next time a president decides a piece of Canadian territory is strategically important? Or that Mexico should be pressured to accept certain policies? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the questions policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic are asking right now. The situation is fluid, it is serious, and it does not have an obvious resolution. What we know is this: the European Union has a tool it has never used. The United States has made a demand no European country is willing to meet, and both sides are running out of room to maneuver. February 1st is less than 2 weeks away. The tariffs are coming, and Europe is deciding whether to fire back. What happens next will shape transatlantic relations and global trade for years to come. And right now, no one knows how this ends. Let me walk you through the historical context here because it actually matters for understanding why Europe is reacting the way it is. The United States has tried to acquire Greenland before, multiple times. The first serious effort came in 1867, when Secretary of State William Seward, the same man who purchased Alaska, considered buying both Greenland and Iceland. The idea didn't advance, partly because of political backlash over the Alaska purchase itself. In 1946, President Harry Truman made an actual offer, $100 million in gold. This was during the early Cold War, when the Arctic was seen as a potential front line against the Soviet Union. Denmark said no. But the U.S. did negotiate a defense agreement in 1951 that allowed the construction of Thule Air Base, now known as Pituffik Space Base, which remains operational today. During the Cold War, the U.S. operated up to 17 bases on Greenland at peak. Most were closed later, but the strategic interest never entirely disappeared. The Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed acquisition again in 1955. That didn't go anywhere either. Then came Trump's first term. In August 2019, he publicly floated buying Greenland and described it as a real estate transaction. Denmark's prime minister called the idea absurd. Trump canceled a state visit in response. At the time, it seemed like an embarrassing footnote, a moment of diplomatic awkwardness that would be forgotten. It wasn't forgotten. Trump brought it up again during the 2024 campaign. And once back in office, he moved quickly. The special envoy appointment, Vance's visit, the escalating rhetoric, all of this happened within Trump's first year back. It culminated in the January 17th tariff announcement. So this isn't spontaneous. This is a long-standing American interest that Trump has now converted into active policy. And that's part of what concerns European leaders. They're not dealing with an impulsive reaction. They're dealing with a systematic pressure campaign. Now let's look at what the EU has actually built with the anti-coercion instrument. The ACI was years in the making. The European Commission proposed it in December 2021 during the aftermath of China's economic pressure on Lithuania. That episode exposed a vulnerability. When Beijing started blocking Lithuanian goods and pressuring companies with Lithuanian supply chains, the EU had no unified mechanism to respond. It relied on ad hoc diplomacy and WTO procedures that moved too slowly. The proposal was debated for nearly 2 years. There were concerns about overreach. Some member states worried it would be used too easily and provoke unnecessary conflicts. Others wanted stronger language. In the end, the European Parliament approved it in October 2023, and the Council adopted it the following month. It entered into force on December 27, 2023. The instrument is built around a specific definition of coercion, a third country using trade or investment measures, or threats of such measures, to interfere with the legitimate sovereign choices of the EU or its member states. That language is important. It means the EU doesn't have to prove economic harm in the traditional sense. It has to prove intent to influence policy through economic pressure. Trump's tariff announcement arguably meets that standard. He has explicitly linked the tariffs to a specific political demand, the sale of Greenland. The tariffs aren't being justified on trade balance grounds or industrial protection grounds. They're being presented as leverage to compel a territorial transfer. That's textbook coercion under the ACI's framework. The measures the EU can take in response are broader than traditional trade remedies. Let me break them down in more detail. On goods, the EU can impose customs duties above most favored nation rates, introduce quotas, require import licenses, and restrict transit. This would hit American exporters directly: agricultural products, machinery, vehicles. On services, the EU can restrict access for U.S. companies in digital services, financial services, insurance, and banking. This is where it gets interesting. The U.S. runs a significant services surplus with Europe. American tech companies, in particular, generate enormous revenue from European users and advertisers. Restrictions here would hurt. On investment, the EU can block or condition foreign direct investment from U.S. entities, including mergers, acquisitions, and expansions. American private equity, venture capital, and corporate expansion could all be affected. On public procurement, the EU can exclude U.S. companies from government contracts. Given the scale of EU infrastructure spending, particularly in defense and green technology, this is not trivial. And on intellectual property, the EU can suspend or restrict IP protection for U.S. entities. Pharmaceuticals, entertainment, technology, industries that depend on patent and trademark enforcement could find their protections weakened. Taken together, analysts estimate these measures could cost the U.S. economy somewhere between $50 billion and $150 billion in exports and services, affecting hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's the scale we're talking about. Now, it's worth noting that the EU hasn't actually done any of this yet. As of today, January 19th, the anti-coercion instrument remains unused. EU officials have described it as a nuclear option, something you threaten but hope never to deploy. But the fact that it's being openly discussed at the ambassadorial level and that Macron is lobbying for activation represents a significant shift. This is the closest the EU has ever come to using it. And there's a second track running alongside the ACI debate: the retaliatory tariff package. This is separate from the anti-coercion instrument. It's a more conventional response. The EU maintained a list of potential targets during the first Trump administration, ready to impose tariffs on American goods if trade disputes escalated. That list was updated in 2025 following the July trade deal and now stands at $93 billion, roughly $108 billion. The target sectors reportedly include bourbon, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, agricultural products like soybeans and poultry, Boeing aircraft and components, and various consumer goods. These are chosen strategically. They hit Republican-leaning states and politically sensitive industries. If the EU activates both tracks, retaliatory tariffs and the anti-coercion instrument, the combined pressure on the U.S. economy would be substantial. But here's the other side of that equation. Europe is vulnerable too. Germany alone exports about $236 billion in goods to the United States annually. A trade war would hurt German automakers, chemical manufacturers, and machinery exporters. The Netherlands and France have significant exposure. The UK, which is not an EU member but is included in Trump's tariff list, faces its own set of calculations. And beyond immediate trade, there's the question of energy. Europe still depends partly on American LNG. Defense cooperation could be affected. Technology partnerships, research collaborations, financial market integration, all of these are intertwined. So this isn't a situation where Europe can retaliate without cost. The costs are real. The question is whether the cost of not retaliating is higher. Let me bring in some of the voices who've weighed in on this. Jeremy Gallon, who studies transatlantic relations, argued that if the EU fails to respond, it will be humiliated, that backing down would invite further coercion in the future. Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič has taken a more cautious line, calling ACI activation a last resort, and emphasizing the importance of dialogue. Manfred Weber, the leader of the European People's Party in the European Parliament, pushed for suspending the 2025 trade deal ratification, which happened. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who has generally sought to maintain good relations with Trump, described the tariffs as a mistake and called for de-escalation. Antonio Costa, the European Council president, warned of a dangerous downward spiral, but stressed that the EU would remain united. These aren't uniform positions. But notice what they all have in common. None of them are saying Trump's demands are legitimate. The debate is over how to respond, not whether Trump is right. That consensus matters. Because if the EU were divided on the underlying question, if some countries thought Greenland should be sold, then the bloc's position would be much weaker. But there's no such division. Every EU government that has spoken publicly has rejected Trump's demand. So has Greenland. So has Denmark. The only question is tactics. Let me also address something that's been circulating in certain corners. The idea that Trump is panicking in response to European resistance. That framing is in the video title. And I want to be honest with you. There's no public evidence that Trump is panicking. His rhetoric has remained assertive. His tariff announcement was delivered as a confident policy decision, not a reactive scramble. What is fair to say is this: Trump's approach appears to have underestimated European resolve. The joint military exercises in Greenland, coordinated by multiple European countries, were a visible show of solidarity that Trump may not have anticipated. The speed of the EU response, emergency meetings, suspension of trade deal ratification, was faster than during his first term. So whether you call that panic or miscalculation depends on your framing. But the facts are clear. Europe is not folding, and that changes the dynamics of this confrontation. Now let's talk about what could actually resolve this. Option 1, Trump withdraws or suspends the tariffs. He claims a diplomatic victory, maybe pointing to vague European commitments on defense spending or investment, and moves on. This is the off-ramp that some European officials are hoping for. It's consistent with Trump's transactional style. He gets to declare he won something without actually acquiring Greenland. Option 2, the EU backs down. This seems unlikely given the political dynamics, but it's theoretically possible. If the US applies enough pressure, particularly on countries with large trade exposures, some member states might push for accommodation. The risk is that this would validate coercive tactics and invite future pressure. Option 3, both sides escalate. Tariffs go into effect February 1st. The EU responds with retaliatory tariffs and possibly ACI activation. Markets react, supply chains are disrupted, both sides dig in, and the dispute becomes protracted. This is the worst-case scenario economically, but it may be where we're heading. Option 4, some kind of creative compromise. A new security arrangement for Greenland that gives the US more access or influence without transferring sovereignty. This would require Greenland's consent, which hasn't been given, and Trump has rejected partial solutions. So it's hard to see how this comes together without a significant shift in his position. None of these options are clean. All of them have costs. And that brings me to the final piece of this. What does it mean for the world beyond the United States and Europe? If this dispute escalates into a full trade war between the two largest Western economies, it will have ripple effects. Global supply chains that run through both the US and EU will be disrupted. Companies will face difficult choices about where to invest and where to manufacture. Financial markets will price in prolonged uncertainty. Beyond economics, there's the strategic dimension. China and Russia are watching this closely. A fracture in the transatlantic alliance creates opportunities for both. If NATO's cohesion is damaged, if European defense spending is diverted to economic conflict with the US, if trust between allies erodes, all of that benefits adversaries. Some observers have suggested that Trump's pressure on Greenland could accelerate European moves toward strategic autonomy, building defense capabilities that don't depend on the United States, diversifying trade relationships away from American markets. That would be a generational shift. It's not going to happen overnight, but moments like this are how such shifts begin. The institutions that have governed transatlantic relations since World War II were built on a set of assumptions: that allies don't economically coerce each other, that territorial sovereignty is respected, that disputes are resolved through diplomacy rather than threats. Those assumptions are now being tested, and the outcome of this test, whether the EU fires its trade bazooka, whether Trump backs down, whether some compromise is found, will set precedents that extend far beyond Greenland. So where does that leave us? The tariffs are coming on February 1st unless something changes. The EU is divided on tactics but united on principle. Trump shows no public sign of backing down. Greenland has made clear it doesn't want to be American territory. Denmark has made clear it won't be coerced. NATO allies are watching anxiously. Markets are reacting. And a tool that has never been used, the anti-coercion instrument, is closer to deployment than it has ever been. This is a live situation. It is developing in real time, and its consequences will be felt for years. What we're watching is not just a trade dispute. It's a test of whether the post-World War II international order, built on rules, alliances, and mutual respect among democracies, can survive the return of great power coercion from within the alliance itself. That's the stakes. That's why this matters. And that's why you should pay attention to what happens next.